NBC Studio, Manhattan, April 3, 1963. The cameras are live coast to coast, 2.3 million viewers watching when James Whitmore, veteran NBC journalist, Yale-educated establishment voice, lunges across the interview desk and slaps Malcolm X across the face on national television. The sound echoes through the studio. Malcolm's head turns with the impact. Blood appears on his lip. The audience gasps. Producers scream to cut the feed, but it's too late. This is live. Malcolm X slowly turns his head back to the camera. He doesn't raise his hand, doesn't stand up. A white leather notebook with a coffee stain on the cover falls from his jacket pocket to the studio floor. Whitmore stands over him, fists still raised, breathing hard. Malcolm speaks 5 words, quietly, deliberately, directly into the microphone. James Whitmore drops to one knee. On live television, in front of millions. What Malcolm X said in that moment reveals everything about psychological warfare, and why some victories come at a cost no one sees. Spring 1963. Malcolm X is one of the most controversial voices in America. National organizer for the civil rights movement, powerful speaker, 300 speaking engagements per year, every campus, every network, every public forum that'll have him. The public knows the firebrand, the uncompromising rhetoric, the refusal to back down, the angry activist white America fears. But there's another Malcolm, one the cameras don't show. In hotel rooms at 3 a.m., he sits with that white leather notebook, the one with the coffee stain from a Philadelphia diner in 1957. He fills pages with observations, psychological profiles, rhetorical strategies. Every spontaneous response in front of those cameras, rehearsed, tested, refined. Malcolm studies his opponents for weeks before debates, knows their arguments better than they do, knows their backgrounds, their insecurities, the exact pressure points that'll make them break. That notebook is his arsenal, not anger, calculation. The church basement where he organizes holds 200 people on Sundays. But Malcolm is preparing for audiences of millions. He knows television is the battlefield, and he's learning the rules while everyone thinks he's just improvising rage. James Whitmore is the establishment. That's what people say. Veteran NBC journalist with 15 years at the network. Yale educated. Published voice on national affairs. His op-eds appear in major newspapers. He represents the moderate position, gradual change, law and order, patience, working within the system. Everything Malcolm X opposes. For months they've been circling each other in print. Whitmore writes that Malcolm is a dangerous agitator destroying any hope of peaceful progress. Malcolm calls establishment voices like Whitmore comfortable defenders of an unjust status quo. The personal tension runs deeper than politics. Whitmore sees Malcolm as an uneducated radical playing at revolution. Malcolm sees Whitmore as a man who profits from maintaining systems that hurt people. When NBC approaches both about a live television debate, the producers smell ratings gold. Radical activist versus establishment journalist. Live, no script, no safety net. Whitmore demands the confrontation. He wants to expose Malcolm as the extremist he believes him to be. Malcolm accepts immediately. But not because he's angry, because he sees opportunity. The stage is set for April 3rd. What Whitmore doesn't know is that Malcolm has already won. 3 weeks before the broadcast, Malcolm begins his research. Every James Whitmore article, every interview, every public appearance he can find footage of. He watches Whitmore's body language, the way he responds to challenges, where his confidence comes from. Malcolm fills the white notebook with observations. One pattern emerges clearly. Whitmore's pride centers on his objectivity, his authority as a newsman, his status as the reasonable voice. His armor is professional credibility. That's also his weakness. Malcolm consults with advisors from the movement, organizers who've been doing this work for years. His mentor gives one warning. Don't let them bait you into violence, brother. Physical response confirms everything they believe about us. Malcolm understands perfectly. Lose control on camera, and you lose everything: the argument, the audience, the war. He spends nights crafting verbal strategies, testing phrases with close associates. One entry appears repeatedly in the notebook, underlined twice: 5 specific words. The words designed to strike not at Whitmore's argument, but at his identity. At the core truth he spent his career building a wall around. Malcolm knows, whoever loses control first loses permanently. April 3, 1963. NBC Studio 8H, Manhattan, where they filmed the big shows. Malcolm arrives 90 minutes early. The white notebook stays in his jacket pocket. He's reviewed it so many times he doesn't need to check. Studio crew buzzing with nervous energy. Everyone knows this could be historic television or a disaster. Probably both. James Whitmore arrives exactly on time, professional, commanding the space. He's visibly confident, working the room, shaking hands with crew members he knows by name. In the green room, neither man speaks. Just sit on opposite sides, 20 feet and a philosophical chasm between them. Malcolm reviews the notebook one final time, closes it, returns it to his pocket. The coffee stain is darker now, 6 years of accumulated use. Producers brief both men. Keep it civil, gentlemen. This is live television. No profanity, no physical contact. We're talking about ideas here. They nod. Professional, reasonable. 2.3 million Americans across the country are tuning in. The studio audience, 150 people, carefully selected for balance, files in. Malcolm notices Whitmore's jaw clenching when he thinks no one's looking. The man is wound tight, coiled, looking for release. This is going to be easier than expected. The cameras go live at 8 p.m. Eastern. The host, a neutral NBC anchor named Arthur Hamilton, introduces 2 vastly different perspectives on the civil rights movement in America. The audience applauds politely. First 15 minutes are relatively calm. Policy discussion, voting rights, employment discrimination, education. Malcolm speaks in measured tones, citing statistics on segregation he'd memorized weeks ago. Whitmore counters with appeals to gradual progress, citing the Constitution and rule of law. Then Whitmore shifts his approach, goes personal. You preach division, Mr. Stone, not unity. Malcolm responds coolly. I preach truth. If truth creates division, examine the lies holding things together. The audience murmurs. Whitmore is getting frustrated. Malcolm won't take the bait, won't play the angry radical role. You're nothing but an agitator who's destroying any chance at real progress. The studio audience gasps. Hamilton tries to intervene, but Malcolm waves him off. Malcolm smiles, that controlled smile he's practiced. And you're defending a system that brutalizes people, calling it civilization. Dead silence in the studio. Whitmore stands up. His fists are clenched at his sides. Malcolm remains seated, unnaturally calm. People watching at home know something is about to break. The contrast on their television screens is stark. Malcolm seated, hands folded, face serene. Whitmore standing, towering over him, every muscle tight. Hamilton signals frantically to producers. Should they cut to commercial? But it's live. And this is exactly the kind of moment that makes careers, or destroys them. Whitmore's voice rises. You don't represent reasonable people. You represent chaos and destruction. Malcolm's response is quiet, almost gentle. And your objectivity is just comfort with injustice, calling it balance. That's when it happens. Whitmore lunges forward. The open-handed slap echoes through the studio like a gunshot. Malcolm's head turns with the impact. The camera operators freeze, uncertain, but they keep filming. It's their job, and nobody's screaming cut yet. Blood appears at the corner of Malcolm's mouth. The audience is screaming. Hamilton is standing, shouting something, but the microphones don't catch it. Producers in the control room are yelling to cut the feed, but the technical director hesitates. This is live coast to coast, and you can't unshow something. Malcolm slowly, deliberately turns his head back to face the camera. He doesn't raise his hand, doesn't stand. The white notebook falls from his jacket pocket, hits the floor. That coffee stain visible for a split second before it's out of frame. James Whitmore stands over him, breathing hard, his hand still raised, ready to strike again. But Malcolm isn't looking at Whitmore. He's looking directly at camera 2, the one with the red light, straight into 2.3 million American homes. His voice is quiet, each word deliberate, spaced, clear. Your children are watching you. 5 words, 23 letters. They hit James Whitmore like bullets. His raised fist falters, drops slowly. Because those words aren't for Malcolm, they're for every parent watching. Every person who claims moral authority, every teacher, every pastor, every community leader. Every person who'd positioned Whitmore as the objective voice, the reasonable one, the professional. And Whitmore just proved Malcolm's entire argument in front of all of them. He lost control. He struck. He validated every accusation about the establishment's true nature that Malcolm X spent his speeches making. While Malcolm sat there, calm, controlled, dignified. The optics are devastating, not just for Whitmore personally, for everything he represents. The objective journalism, the professional distance, the claim to moral high ground, all of it undercut by one moment of rage. And Malcolm made it happen without lifting a finger. Whitmore's face drains of color as the realization hits him. He doesn't hear the audience anymore, doesn't see the cameras. He sees himself through those millions of eyes, through his own children's eyes. The objective journalist who couldn't control his emotions, the professional who resorted to violence, the establishment voice who proved the radical right. His legs give out slightly. He drops to one knee, involuntarily, paralyzed by understanding. On live television, the image will run in every newspaper in the country tomorrow. The establishment kneeling before the activist. The professional booing before the radical. Malcolm X doesn't move, doesn't gloat. Just sits there, blood on his lip, white notebook on the floor beside him, proving his point with silence. The studio erupts in chaos. Producers finally cut the feed, but the East Coast saw everything live. 30 seconds that'll be dissected for decades. By the time the show cuts to an emergency commercial, the phone lines at NBC headquarters are jammed. Communities are split, some outraged at the slap, others at Malcolm's response, still others celebrating that Malcolm didn't strike back. Establishment voices are horrified. Their objective journalist lost control on national television. Conservative newspapers will run the story for weeks, proof that even reasonable debate is impossible. Malcolm X calmly stands, picks up the white notebook, returns it to his jacket pocket, wipes the blood from his lip with a handkerchief. James Whitmore still on one knee, staring at nothing. Hamilton tries to interview Malcolm, but he declines. "I think the moment speaks for itself," Malcolm says. Leaves the studio without further statement. Whitmore also leaves quickly, surrounded by NBC staff, still unable to form words. Outside, reporters already gathered. Malcolm gives a brief comment. Mr. Whitmore forgot himself for a moment. Truth requires no violence, only clarity. By evening, every newspaper in America is running some version of the story. NBC journalist strikes civil rights leader on live TV. Whitmore loses control during debate. Malcolm X remains calm under physical attack. The photographs tell the story better than words. Whitmore standing over Malcolm, fist raised. Whitmore on one knee. Malcolm's face, calm, blood on lip. The narrative writes itself, and it's not the narrative Whitmore wanted. Organizations scramble to respond. Moderate groups issue statements condemning both the slap and Malcolm's provocative rhetoric. But nobody can explain away the image of James Whitmore on his knees. Nobody can undo what 2.3 million people witnessed. And nobody, absolutely nobody, can figure out how Malcolm X orchestrated the entire thing without throwing a single punch. The reporters dig deeper over the following days. One detail keeps surfacing in photographs from Malcolm's earlier television appearances. That white leather notebook with the coffee stain. It's always there. Every interview, every debate, every public appearance. A wire service photographer has shots from Malcolm's appearance on a Boston talk show 2 months earlier. Notebook visible in his jacket pocket. From a university lecture at Columbia, notebook on the podium. From a street rally in Harlem, notebook tucked under his arm. Someone close to the movement, speaking anonymously, tells the New York Times that Malcolm had been preparing for the Whitmore confrontation for 3 weeks, that he'd predicted Whitmore would break under the right pressure, that those 5 words, "Your children are watching you," had been rehearsed, refined, tested on close associates to gauge their impact. The white notebook surfaces in the investigation like a recurring character. What else was in there? What other psychological operations had Malcolm mapped out? NBC requests an interview, wants Malcolm to address the claims that he'd orchestrated the whole incident. Malcolm agrees. He shows up with the notebook, sits calmly across from the interviewer, and opens selected pages for the camera. Years of notes, psychological observations, rhetorical strategies. One entry from 3 weeks before the incident, dated March 13, 1963. Whitmore will break if cornered properly. His fear of appearing biased to his audience. That fear is his weakness. Another entry, dated March 20th. 5-word response. Make him see himself through their eyes, through his children's eyes. The 5-word phrase is there, underlined twice. Your children are watching you. Dated 2 weeks before he spoke them on camera. Malcolm leans back, closes the notebook. I knew he would strike, he says calmly. I wanted him to, not because I wanted to be hit, but because I wanted the world to see the difference between emotional reaction and strategic thinking. Mr. Whitmore taught America a valuable lesson that night, just not the one he intended. James Whitmore disappears from public view for 2 months after the incident. NBC quietly reassigns him from primetime anchoring, scheduling adjustments, the press release says. Speaking engagements are canceled across the country. His regular op-ed column is suspended indefinitely. The one interview he does with Newsweek 6 weeks later is painful to read. Malcolm X baited me, Whitmore says. He's a master manipulator who engineered the entire situation to make me look like a hypocrite. The public doesn't buy it. They saw what happened. They saw Malcolm sit there calmly while Whitmore lost control. They heard those 5 words that exposed something fundamental, that claims to objectivity can mask comfort with injustice, and that mask can slip. Malcolm's influence grows. The movement gains momentum in the months following the incident. Your children are watching you becomes a rallying cry at demonstrations and sit-ins, printed on protest signs, on buttons, spray-painted on walls. The phrase captures something about moral accountability, about the performance of respectability, about what we're teaching the next generation through our actions. Establishment voices try to condemn both men equally, calling for civility on all sides. The position becomes untenable. You can't defend a man who slapped someone on live television, but you also can't fully dismiss what Malcolm represents. Moderate voices find themselves caught exactly where Malcolm wanted them. Whitmore attempts a comeback that fall, writing an essay for Harper's defending his actions, explaining the pressure he was under, the ways Malcolm had deliberately provoked him over months. Some editors are sympathetic, but the image is permanent. James Whitmore on one knee before Malcolm X. The establishment defeated by the activist, not through violence, but through exposure. Whitmore's professional authority, his carefully cultivated objectivity, destroyed by a single moment of uncontrolled rage. But Malcolm paid a price, too. Less visible, more dangerous. FBI surveillance intensified after the incident. Internal memo, declassified decades later. Subject demonstrates dangerous level of psychological warfare capability. Standard intimidation tactics ineffective. Recommend elevated monitoring. The white notebook became part of Malcolm's FBI file. Agents wanted to know what else was in there, what other operations he'd planned, who else he'd profiled. The Bureau understood what much of the public missed. Malcolm X wasn't just passionate. He was strategic, disciplined, effective. Those 5 words proved it. Within the movement itself, the incident created tension. Some organizers publicly praised Malcolm for not retaliating physically, but privately, some grew uneasy. Malcolm's fame was growing beyond the movement's control. The white notebook represented something that made people uncomfortable. Cold calculation, psychological warfare, intellectual combat. Some felt it conflicted with the moral and spiritual foundations of the movement. Malcolm was operating on a different level, and that made him both powerful and isolated. The seeds of internal conflict were planted in that moment of triumph. The 5 words that elevated him also marked him as someone who played by different rules. By late 1963, relationships within the movement began to strain. Multiple factors contributed, but one element was clear. Malcolm had demonstrated independent power on that NBC stage. He hadn't needed consultation or approval. He'd engineered his own victory with his own methods. That white notebook symbolized Malcolm's analytical approach, his evolution into something the movement both needed and feared. The man who'd made James Whitmore kneel would eventually find himself questioning whether the victory was worth the isolation. But that realization came later. Years after the incident, James Whitmore wrote about it in a 1970 essay for The Atlantic. The passages are remarkable for their honesty. Malcolm X saw through me to my fear, Whitmore wrote. I slapped him because I couldn't match him intellectually, couldn't defend my position under his scrutiny, and couldn't bear having that inadequacy exposed to America. To my children, he knew exactly what he was doing. I was simply reacting. The 5 words haunted Whitmore for the rest of his life. Every professional interaction, he found himself wondering, am I being honest or performing? Am I seeking truth or defending comfort? Are my children watching? The psychological impact of that moment led Whitmore on a personal journey. He began questioning the positions he'd defended, started examining his own role in systems he'd claimed to objectively observe. By 1968, he was writing more sympathetically about civil rights activism, acknowledging that calls for patience often meant asking others to endure injustice. The man who'd slapped Malcolm X on television eventually became one of the more thoughtful chroniclers of the movement's moral complexity. But the damage to Whitmore's reputation never fully healed. He never got back what he had before April 3, 1963. The prestigious assignments came less frequently. The invitations to speak became rare. The image of him on one knee replayed in his mind constantly, he wrote. That's when I understood what Malcolm was trying to teach, that we're all being watched by history, by our children, by ourselves, and we can't hide from that gaze. In multiple essays published between 1967 and 1975, Whitmore mentioned Malcolm's white notebook. He knew me better than I knew myself, Whitmore wrote. That notebook contained a truth about me I'd spent my career avoiding. Malcolm X continued his activism through the 1960s and beyond. The white leather notebook was always present. The coffee stain still visible on the cover, darker now from years of handling. Eventually, Malcolm donated it to a civil rights museum, where it sits today behind glass. The later entries show evolution in his thinking. One entry from 1965 stands out. The notebook taught me that control is power, but I'm learning that control without humanity is just another weapon. Another way to keep people at a distance. There are reflections on the Whitmore incident. I won that moment, but I missed the man, made him kneel when I might have helped him stand. We were both performing, me for the movement, him for the establishment. The 5 words freed neither of us, just exposed us both. The next page reads, real change requires more than clever responses, requires connection, requires seeing the humanity even in opponents. The notebook was a tool, but tools can become crutches, can become walls. James Whitmore retired from journalism in 1972, writing occasionally but never reclaiming his former prominence. He died in 1984, age 61. Never fully escaped the shadow of that slap, that kneel, those 5 words. The white leather notebook with the coffee stain sits in a climate-controlled display case at the National Civil Rights Museum. Thousands of people view it every year. School groups, researchers, activists, people who remember April 3, 1963, and people who only know it from textbooks. The controversy remains. Was Malcolm's strategy brilliant or manipulative? Did those 5 words advance justice or just one man's legend? The debate continues. The coffee stain is darker now, almost black in certain light. The ink has faded on some pages, but those 5 words remain visible when the notebook is opened for special exhibitions. Your children are watching you. Still true, still uncomfortable, still necessary. The notebook outlasted them both. Sits behind glass, asking questions about tactics and morality, about victory and cost, about the difference between winning a moment and changing hearts, proving that the most powerful weapon was never violence. It was truth, even when truth came wrapped in strategy. Total, narrative only, 3,004 words.